The world outside their suits was a nightmare. The air was thick, swirling with yellowish toxins, and the ground beneath them seemed to ripple with heat. Venus was alive in a way that felt hostile, angry even. No matter how advanced their equipment, they couldn't fully escape the relentless, crushing heat or the strange, ghostly pressure pressing against their helmets. Captain Ross, with his grim expression, led the group forward, each step measured, each breath carefully controlled. Their mission was simple: investigate reports of strange signals detected in the Venusian atmosphere. They were a small crew chosen for their skills and endurance. Ross, the hardened leader, kept the team steady, his tone always somewhere between caution and command. Right behind him was Dr. Elena Marquez, a brilliant, driven scientist who'd become almost obsessed with the prospect of alien life. Her quick, sharp eyes caught every detail, her mind already racing ahead to what they might find. Harlan Stone, the group's seasoned mechanic, brought up the rear. He was the skeptic, a man of steel nerves who'd seen enough of the universe to know that sometimes you were better off not finding what you were looking for. Then there was Isaac Holloway, a quiet engineer, strangely distant even before the mission began. He barely spoke, his presence more like a shadow than a man. For days they had trekked across Venus's desolate surface, each step a brutal reminder of how hostile this planet was. But then they saw it, a structure looming in the distance, a dark shape partially hidden by the thick, sulphurous fog. The sight of it made them all pause. The base was enormous, almost otherworldly in its design. Unlike the rigid, functional lines of human architecture, this was strange, organic, like it had been grown rather than built. "This has to be it," Elena whispered, her voice crackling through the comms. "The source of the signal." Captain Ross hesitated for only a moment. "Stay close. We don't know what we're dealing with yet." As they approached, details came into view. Impossibly smooth walls that seemed to ripple with a faint, eerie glow under the haze, jagged arches that looked like they could open and close, as if the building itself were alive. Harlan felt a shiver crawl up his spine. The place looked too strange, too alive, and yet it felt abandoned. The entrance, a massive doorway with a smooth, iris-like design, slid open as they neared. It was almost as if the base had sensed their presence, allowing them in. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply. The oppressive heat from outside vanished, replaced by a strange, damp chill that made the hairs on the back of Harlan's neck stand on end. His instincts were screaming at him, warning him to turn back. "I don't like this," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder. Dr. Marquez, on the other hand, was mesmerized. Her eyes sparkled with excitement, her fingers twitching with the urge to start collecting samples, taking notes, anything, to make sense of the alien wonder before them. She was the first to spot the control panels on the walls, sleek metallic devices with symbols that glowed faintly, a language not meant for human eyes. As she stepped closer, her gloved fingers hovered over the symbols, captivated. This is incredible. It's so advanced. I can't even begin to understand." "We shouldn't be touching anything," Harlan interrupted, his voice sharp with tension. "For all we know, this place could be a trap. Or worse." But Elena ignored him, her fascination overpowering any sense of caution. She tapped a symbol, and a holographic screen flickered to life, spilling soft green light that illuminated their faces. The screen displayed diagrams, symbols, and images that were unmistakably human. Muscle tissue, veins, lungs, each image dissected and annotated in a blend of alien and human text. "What is this?" Ross murmured, leaning in closer. His usually steady voice held an edge of unease. Elena's face was pale, her eyes wide as she scrolled through the images. These are human subjects. Look here." She pointed to a figure on the screen, a diagram showing a human's respiratory system, with notes suggesting modifications. It's like they were modifying them, changing them so they could breathe this atmosphere. The realization sank in slowly, hitting each of them with the same dreadful weight. Harlan's expression turned grim. "This doesn't feel like science. This feels like torture." Just as he said it, they heard a sound echoing from deep within the base. A faint, irregular clicking, like the tapping of metal on metal, or the echo of footsteps on hollow ground. They all froze, waiting, listening. Then the sound vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving only the heavy silence broken by the faint hum of alien machinery. Isaac's eyes darted around, his body tense. "Maybe we should go back," he whispered, barely loud enough for them to hear through the comms. "Whatever they were doing here, it's not meant for us." For the first time, Captain Ross seemed to hesitate, as though the weight of the discovery was settling on him. But Dr. Marquez's eyes were shining with something darker than curiosity. "This is a discovery that could change everything," she said, almost in a trance. "Proof of alien intelligence, advanced beyond anything we can imagine. We can't just leave." Isaac Holloway, who had been silent until now, took a shaky step back, his face drawn and pale. His gaze flitted to each hologram, lingering on certain images with a look of quiet horror, as if he recognized them. He swallowed hard, a faint tremor running through him. Dr. Marquez caught his expression. "Isaac," she said slowly, her voice a blade of suspicion. "Do you know something about this?" He shook his head, his hands trembling. No, I don't know anything. But, I mean, this is wrong." Captain Ross shot him a sharp look. "Wrong doesn't cover half of it. These modifications, they're not just physical." He pointed to a series of notes, lines of alien script interspersed with desperate, scrawled human words. The phrases, psychological breakdown, paranoia, and primal instincts stood out, like warnings scratched in blood. The notes described how the modifications impacted the mind as well as the body. Subjects began losing control over themselves, becoming feral, unable to think beyond survival. Each transformation came with its own mental cost, a twisted sense of territorial aggression, an almost predatory instinct that defied human nature. Isaac shifted uncomfortably, clutching his arms as though trying to hold himself together. His breathing grew shallow, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of the knowledge pressed down on him. Elena's eyes narrowed as she watched him. "Isaac, you're hiding something. If you know anything about what happened here, now is the time to tell us." For a moment, Isaac's eyes flashed with panic, then hollowed out into something darker. He looked down, almost ashamed. I was part of it," he whispered, barely loud enough for them to hear. "I didn't volunteer. I was taken, changed." His words fell heavy in the silence. "They left me here, as an experiment, a test to see how long someone could survive." He let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "I guess I was just a prototype." Harlan's jaw tightened, anger flashing in his eyes. "They did this to you? Turned you into one of them?" Isaac nodded, his gaze distant, as if seeing a nightmare only he could understand. The changes. They didn't stop with my body. I'm not the same person I was. I feel things I can't explain, thoughts that don't belong to me. And when I see you all, it's like something in me wants to... He cut himself off, a look of raw terror crossing his face. Sometimes, I don't trust myself. Elena took a step back, fear flickering in her eyes. She realized now that his odd behavior since the mission began wasn't just the effects of the planet's harsh conditions. It was something deeper, darker, a change wrought by alien hands, a transformation that was still ongoing. She felt a sudden chill, as though Isaac was no longer fully human. Captain Ross stared at Isaac, his voice barely a whisper. Then these notes, the people here, they were trying to change everyone they brought here. Isaac nodded, a distant, hollow look in his eyes. To make us better suited for life on Venus, to adapt, to survive. They saw humans as nothing more than clay, something to mold and shape until we fit their needs. Elena could barely speak, her voice breaking. And what happens to the mind of someone who goes through that? What happened to you, Isaac? Isaac looked at her, his eyes shadowed and haunted. You lose pieces of yourself, parts that make you, you. His voice trembled. The first time I looked in a mirror after they finished, I didn't recognize myself. My thoughts didn't feel like my own. I wanted things I couldn't explain, needed, things that terrified me. It's like they planted something inside me, and it's still growing. A heavy silence followed, each of them absorbing the weight of his words. The base was no longer just a place of discovery, but a testament to a horror beyond comprehension. The walls felt closer, pressing in as if waiting for them to fall under the same monstrous transformation. Harlan finally broke the silence, his voice a low growl. If that's true, we need to get out of here. Now I'm not sticking around to become some experiment for aliens who treat us like lab rats. But Dr. Marquez shook her head almost defiantly. We can't leave. This is the most significant discovery in human history. Alien life that's not just observing us, but actively trying to modify us, change our very nature. Don't you understand? This place holds answers that we've been searching for our entire lives. Harlan's face twisted in fury. Answers? They're turning people into monsters. Marquez, you want to risk turning into one of these things just for answers? Isaac's expression darkened. You don't get it, Harlan. Once you start the change, you can't go back. Whatever they did to me, it's still happening. I can feel it. They made me a hybrid, something that's no longer fully human, and... His voice trailed off as he glanced back toward the darkened corridors. They're not finished with me, or with any of us. Suddenly, a shudder ran through the base, and a low hum began to vibrate through the walls. The holograms flickered, and somewhere deep within the structure, a set of doors slid open, the heavy metal groaning as if it hadn't moved in years. The team froze, each of them overcome with a sense of dread. Elena's voice dropped to a whisper, her tone tinged with both awe and terror. It's like they're waking up. Isaac's face went pale, his hands shaking. They're coming back to complete what they started. He looked at them, a plea in his eyes. If we stay here, they'll take us too. They'll change us, like they changed me. The last of the holograms flickered and died, plunging them into darkness broken only by the faint, pulsing lights along the floor. The echoes of alien voices, like distant murmurs, filled the air. For the first time since they'd arrived, each of them realized how powerless they truly were, like insects trapped in a spider's web, waiting for the monster to return. Captain Ross took a deep breath, his voice hard and steady. "We're leaving. Now." He turned, gesturing for the others to follow, but as they began to make their way back, the walls seemed to close in around them, the base itself shifting and reshaping as though it were alive. They moved faster, the alien hum growing louder, the sensation of being watched more oppressive with every step. And as they fled, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something in her had already started to change. The base seemed darker as they moved deeper, its alien hum transforming into a rhythm that pulsed under their skin, resonating with their heartbeats in an unnatural sync. The walls, smooth and organic, glistened with an oily sheen, each curve and arch mimicking the structure of some vast creature's inner anatomy. It was as though they had been swallowed whole, descending into the belly of some nightmare entity that existed outside the rules of nature. They moved in tense silence, each of them growing increasingly aware of the subtle changes in themselves. Isaac led the way, his footsteps oddly light, as if he knew the base's layout by heart. Elena kept close, her eyes darting between the walls, her face a mixture of fear and fascination. Harlan brought up the rear, his eyes dark with mistrust, his hand gripping his wrench as though it were a lifeline. "Something's wrong," Harlan murmured, his voice barely audible, yet tinged with a growing dread. "Feels like the air's getting thicker." Elena paused, testing her own breath, which now felt ragged and shallow. But it wasn't the thickness of the air. It was something else. Something inside her, gnawing at her sense of self. Her skin itched beneath her suit, a prickling sensation that felt as though tiny creatures were crawling just beneath the surface. She scratched at her arms reflexively, her fingers finding odd, tender lumps forming along her veins. "Keep moving," Isaac said, his voice cold and distant. He barely looked back, his gaze fixed ahead with an eerie focus. "The deeper we go, the closer we get to understanding." Elena shuddered at his words. "Understanding what, Isaac?" "What they did to you." Isaac didn't respond, but there was a flicker of something dark in his eyes, a trace of resignation mixed with the faintest hint of hunger. As they descended further, the lights grew dimmer, and the walls seemed to pulse, like muscles contracting around them. And then, suddenly, the corridor widened, opening into a vast, circular chamber that seemed to swallow their light. Strange consoles and alien apparatuses lined the walls, casting a sickly glow that made the dark shadows seem to crawl. But it was the floor that caught their attention. Scattered across the chamber, arranged like macabre trophies, were bodies, or what was left of them. Twisted, malformed figures lay in piles, their limbs elongated and rearranged, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and pain. Their skin was scorched and blackened, toughened into armor that had failed to protect them from whatever fate had met them here. And their eyes, those that had survived the modifications, stared blindly ahead, empty and devoid of humanity. Elena's stomach twisted as she recognized the modifications. Each body bore signs of the horrific changes described in the data logs. These were the previous subjects, those who had been altered in ways that defied understanding. Some had strange, bulging chests, likely to filter toxins. Others had elongated fingers with dark claws that glistened with a strange residue. All of them looked less than human, more like twisted versions of something becoming, something else, trapped forever between evolution and annihilation. "Oh, my God," Harlan choked out, covering his mouth. He took a step back, nearly stumbling over the remains of a shattered console, his face pale with revulsion. They were experimenting on them, turning them into monsters. Elena felt a cold hand grip her heart. She looked around, her mind racing, realizing that this was not just a lab, it was a graveyard. She barely registered Isaac as he moved toward one of the consoles, his fingers brushing over the alien controls with an ease that suggested familiarity. He looked down at one of the bodies, his expression unreadable. "They were unfinished," he murmured. "They were adapting these people, changing them piece by piece. Some failed, but some adapted." He glanced back at them, his gaze intense. "They're not dead. They're evolving." Harlan's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with fury. "Evolving? They're corpses, Isaac. Or worse. Whatever these things were trying to do, it didn't work. It's torture." But Elena was less certain. She felt something strange, a pulsing curiosity mingled with the deepening unease. As much as she hated the sight before her, a part of her wanted to understand. She forced herself to look, to see the twisted details, the way their flesh had melded with their suits, the strange veins of darkened skin spreading like webs. And as she looked, she felt the faint itch beneath her skin intensify, spreading from her arms to her chest. Almost unconsciously, she scratched harder, her fingers digging through her suit, her nails scraping against raw flesh. She looked down in horror, watching as her skin darkened, veins bulging with an unnatural shade of greenish black. It was as if the air itself was seeping into her, changing her from the inside out. She wasn't alone. Harlan let out a strangled gasp, clutching his head, his face contorting with pain. His reflection caught in a nearby console screen. His skin had taken on an ashen hue, his eyes almost feral, his pupils dilating far beyond normal limits. He gritted his teeth, his breaths coming in ragged gasps, his expression caught between rage and something darker. "What's happening to us?" Elena whispered, her voice trembling as she looked down at her hands, watching as tiny, shimmering scales began to form along her forearms. Isaac's face was calm, almost serene. "The modifications aren't just in these bodies, they're in the air, the very structure of this place, the base. It's like a living thing. It senses us, adapting us. It's not finished." "You knew this," Harlan hissed, stumbling back, his gaze wild with accusation. "You knew this whole time?" Isaac looked away, his expression unreadable. "I tried to warn you, but it's too late now. The base has already started its work. It's finishing the job." Harlan's fury erupted, and he lunged at Isaac, his hands curling into fists, but his movements were sluggish, his body rebelling against him. Isaac stepped aside effortlessly, watching with a strange detachment as Harlan stumbled to his knees, panting heavily. His skin was beginning to harden, taking on the darkened, scaled look of the corpses around them. Elena felt her own mind slipping, thoughts clouding as something primal crept into her consciousness. Her instincts were shifting, as though her own body was no longer entirely hers. She could feel a new urge, an impulse that had nothing to do with survival or fear. It was a hunger, dark and ancient, a need to consume, to dominate, to mark this place as hers. She looked over at Isaac, who watched them both with a strange, resigned acceptance. "Why? Why aren't you affected?" she demanded, her voice edged with desperation. Isaac tilted his head, his eyes dark and distant. "I already went through it. They made me adaptable. That's why I was left here, to see if I could survive alone, if I could resist." He trailed off, his gaze flickering to the dark shadows around them. "But the more time I spent here, the more I realized there's no going back." Elena's breath caught, a scream clawing at her throat. "What do you mean, no going back?" Isaac's voice was barely above a whisper. "Once you're changed, you're theirs. Part of you never leaves this place." As his words sank in, the chamber shuddered, and the alien hum intensified, resonating deep in their bones. The walls seemed to close in, pulsating with a sick, eager energy, as though the base itself were feeding off their transformations. A low, guttural growl escaped Harlan's throat, his body twitching as he fought the changes rippling through him. His face contorted, his pupils blown wide, his fingers twisting into claws. He looked at Elena, his gaze now foreign, filled with a predatory intent that was no longer human. Elena backed away, her heart pounding. "Harlan, no, this isn't you." But Harlan didn't respond. His breaths were heavy, erratic, each one tinged with a low snarl as he took a step toward her, his movements jerky, as if he were fighting himself. Suddenly, something snapped inside him, and he lunged, his body moving with unnatural speed. Elena barely dodged, stumbling backward, her heart racing as she tried to keep her distance. But she could feel the same primal urges rising within herself, a territorial aggression she couldn't control. Isaac watched them both, his expression sorrowful yet distant, as though he'd seen this before, had known it was inevitable. "The base is changing you," he murmured. "It's making you part of itself. Soon you won't remember who you were." Elena clutched her head, her thoughts slipping like sand through her fingers. Memories blurred, her sense of identity fracturing as the alien impulses took hold. She tried to remember her life on Earth, but the images were fading, replaced by a dark, creeping hunger that spread like poison through her veins. And then a new realization dawned on her, something far worse than she had imagined. The bodies on the floor, the grotesque remains, they weren't just victims. They were predecessors, failed attempts at perfection. Each of them had once been like her, a human lost in this place, transformed into something monstrous and left to decay. As the last of her resistance faded, she looked up, meeting Isaac's gaze, a silent plea in her eyes. But Isaac merely shook his head, his voice barely a whisper, filled with a hollow sadness. "There's no stopping it, Elena. This place was built to adapt us, to make us like them. And once it starts, it never lets go." The base pulsed around them, the walls closing in, sealing their fate within its dark, living structure. The walls of the alien base closed in with a sentient awareness, breathing in sync with the dark, primal rhythm pounding in their chests. Elena, Harlan, and Isaac stood at the heart of the structure, surrounded by the grim reminders of failed experiments, the malformed bodies of the ones who came before them. The alien hum grew louder, vibrating in their bones, filling the space with a suffocating dread. Something had awakened, and it was coming. The lights around them dimmed, the once steady glow flickering as if in anticipation. the corridors filled with shadow, and with every passing second it felt as if the walls themselves were expanding and contracting, like lungs filling with air. A cold shiver ran down Elena's spine. She glanced at Harlan, whose face was nearly unrecognizable. Ashen skin stretched too tight over bulging veins, eyes wild and unfocused. His fingers twitched, claws extending where nails once were, and she could see his mouth twitching, fighting to control an urge he didn't understand, an urge he barely recognized as his own. "Do you hear that?" Harlan whispered, his voice low, gravelly, almost feral. Elena heard it too, a faint, rhythmic clicking, like the legs of some massive insect scraping against metal. It echoed through the dark corridors, growing louder, closer, until it seemed to come from all around them. Each click resonated with the heartbeat of the bass, and with every sound a wave of dread washed over them, threatening to drown whatever fragments of humanity they had left. Isaac's face was impassive, resigned. He looked like a ghost, a man who had already died long ago, left only as an empty shell to await his creator's return. "They're here," he whispered, his voice hollow, devoid of hope. "They've come back to finish it." Elena's heart raced, her mind a chaotic blur. The air felt thick, pressing in, filling her lungs with a foreign heat that burned from the inside out. Her skin itched, and she could feel the modifications taking hold, her body changing against her will. Every part of her wanted to run, but the base seemed to root her in place, holding her there as if she, too, was now part of its living structure. The shadows shifted, deepening until the chamber around them was swallowed in darkness. And then, out of that darkness, they saw movement. Figures, tall, slender, their forms distorted and alien, flickering like mirages as they emerged from the depths of the base. Their skin glistened in the dim light, a slick, dark substance covering them like a second skin, their limbs elongated, unnatural. The aliens stood before them, silent and watching, their eyes a sickly, luminescent green. Their gaze held no warmth, no compassion, only the cold, clinical interest of beings observing their test subjects. One of the creatures tilted its head, a slow, deliberate movement, as though assessing each of them in turn. Its eyes lingered on Isaac, who shrank back, his face twisting with fear and shame. A thin, alien hand lifted, pointing at him. The creature spoke, its voice a low, guttural resonance, each word pulsing with an otherworldly cadence that echoed in their minds rather than their ears. The language was incomprehensible, but the tone held no doubt this was not a greeting. It was a command, one that required Isaac's submission. Isaac dropped to his knees, his face a mask of pain and resignation. I can't resist them," he muttered, his voice choked. He looked at Elena, his eyes pleading, but there was no longer any part of him that could fight back. "I belong to them now. We all do." The creature took a step closer, its elongated fingers reaching out, hovering just above Isaac's head. Elena could feel the strange power emanating from it, a force that made her bones ache and her skin crawl. She wanted to scream, to pull him away, to fight, but her body refused to move, locked in place by the overwhelming weight of fear and the growing sense of futility. The creature's hand finally touched Isaac's head, and in that instant he let out a sound, half scream, half moan, filled with a despair that echoed through the chamber. His body convulsed, twitching as the alien's touch seemed to activate something within him. His skin darkened further, veins bulging, his form twisting into something no longer human. It was as if the creature were molding him, reshaping him with nothing more than its presence, completing the transformation that had begun long ago. Elena looked away, tears stinging her eyes, her heart breaking as she listened to Isaac's cries fade into guttural, inhuman sounds. She had never felt so helpless, so utterly powerless. She could feel the creature's gaze shift to her, an unspoken command that pulled her gaze back to its cold, alien eyes. The creature lifted its hand, and Elena braced herself, expecting the same fate. But then she noticed something. Its eyes held a faint glimmer of curiosity, as if it were considering her. She felt a dark, invasive presence pressing into her mind, probing her thoughts, her memories, as though it were judging her worth, deciding whether she was suitable for the same fate. "No," she whispered, barely aware that she had spoken. "I'm not yours." Harlan's voice cut through the silence, raw and defiant. "If you're going to take her, you'll have to go through me first," he snarled, his hands clenched into fists, his body trembling with rage and fear. He looked at Elena, his face a mix of pain and something she hadn't seen before. Resolve. The alien turned its attention to Harlan, its gaze sharp and piercing. For a brief moment there was silence, a stillness so intense it felt like the entire base was holding its breath. And then, with a sudden, horrifying fluidity, the creature lunged. Harlan barely had time to react before it was upon him, its fingers digging into his shoulders, pinning him against the wall. His scream echoed through the chamber, raw and primal, as the creature began its work. Elena watched, paralyzed as Harlan's skin darkened, his veins twisting and bulging under the creature's touch. His body contorted, reshaping itself in unnatural ways, his screams becoming guttural, animalistic sounds as he lost himself to the alien transformation. But even in his final moments, Harlan's eyes locked onto Elena's, a silent plea mixed with the last remnants of humanity. And then he was gone, his face contorted into an expression that was no longer his own. The creature stepped back, leaving Harlan's twisted form slumped against the wall, his once fierce eyes now empty, blank. Elena felt a wave of nausea, her heart pounding in her chest as the creature turned back to her, its gaze colder than before. She knew what it wanted. It wasn't finished. She was next. But something deep within her rebelled. In that moment, a surge of defiance washed over her, a desperate, primal urge to survive. She refused to be reshaped, to be molded into something alien. She would not let them take her soul. With a final scream of defiance, she bolted, her legs carrying her into the darkness. The chamber walls blurred as she ran, her breath ragged, her mind consumed by a single thought: escape. She could feel them behind her, the creatures moving with unnatural speed, their footsteps silent yet relentless. The corridors twisted, shifting around her, leading her deeper into the base. Her mind raced, grasping at any thought, any plan that might save her. She didn't know where she was going, but it didn't matter. All she knew was that she couldn't stop, couldn't let them catch her. She could hear the alien hum intensifying, vibrating through the walls, pulsing in her ears like a heartbeat. Their heartbeat, their minds pressing into hers, pulling her back. Ahead, she saw a faint glimmer of light, a doorway, the exit. With one last burst of energy, she lunged toward it, her hand outstretched, her entire body yearning for freedom. But just as she reached it, the base shuddered, and the doorway slid shut, sealing her inside. The walls seemed to close in around her, and she heard the faint clicking of the creatures drawing closer, their presence pressing down on her like a weight. She turned, her back against the sealed door, watching as the creatures approached, their eyes glowing with a terrible hunger. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding, her hands clenched into fists. They would not take her without a fight. The alien hum filled the chamber, the sound of it twisting in her mind, swallowing her thoughts, consuming her last shreds of resistance. She closed her eyes, a single tear sliding down her cheek, knowing that this was the end. And then, just before the darkness claimed her, she felt something. An echo, a faint, unbreakable part of herself, a part that would never surrender. The chamber fell silent and the bass went still, the hum fading as the creatures retreated, their work complete. Weeks later, a faint signal was detected, emanating from the heart of the alien base on Venus. The message was garbled, filled with static, barely decipherable. But one thing was clear. A voice, hollow and distorted, yet unmistakably human. We have adapted. The transformation is complete. The next wave awaits. The signal went silent, lost in the depths of space, but its echo lingered, a promise that the experiments were far from over. Somewhere on Earth, the message was received, and preparations began for the next mission.